Let's knit the fastest, easiest tubular hats ever. To make them tubular, we're going to use the settings on the knitting machine, main bed, and ribber that allow one bed to knit one way and the other bed the alternate way, so the yarn goes around and round, making a circle or a tube. In this video, we'll do the very easiest methods. No bells and whistles. In future videos, I will show you how to add ribbing and shaped crowns onto these hats. Here we will either just gather the crown, as in this hat, or seam the top edge, as in this one. If you seam the top together, there is the obvious appearance of ears, which you can enhance by adding very simple features, such as just buttons for eyes or a little bit of embroidery. I won't go into that in this video more than to just show how obviously possible it is. This video pattern is an expansion of one in my Stripping for Charity book. In the book, it's available in several sizes, from big kids through adults, and multiple gauges. So in this video, we're going to make a smaller size, 16 inches in circumference, which is likely to fit toddlers. Those who own the book are going to be sent this pattern as an upgrade, and it will also appear in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. For those who only have flatbed machines and single bed machines, I recently did a video for these hats, which is now on YouTube, so you are not forgotten, you can knit also. We'll do 3 different brim styles. Both of these are a rolled brim, but one fits more snugly than the other, and that's easy to arrange. I'll show you how. Those who crochet can also use this pattern to make the tube and crochet the brim. Crowns may be seamed to get that ear-like effect, and I'll show you 2 ways, or gathered like this. You may use any number 4 or worsted weight yarn. I'm using this one, and this is a very good use of this yarn. You'll need to adjust your machine so that both beds get 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch. Engage 36 needles on each bed. Rack so that they alternate, as shown here, because on some occasions all are going to come out at once while we cast on. Knit across at a very small stitch size using waste yarn to begin with, and create the zigzag row. Insert the ribber comb from below, tooth side up, and insert the ribber comb wire into it. Then hang some weights in the comb. Increase the stitch size about 2 numbers, and for brother machines, set 1 part button on each carriage. They must be on the opposite sides. Most ribber plus main bed combinations in all brands can do this work. You'll just have different settings to get there. Knit 2 rows. One bed will knit going in one direction. The second bed will knit going in the other direction. When you get done, check and make sure that in fact has happened. Knit a few rows in waste yarn. Now at this point, our needles are still offset from one another. Use the racking handle to make them oppose perfectly. We're not going to use them all at once at all anymore, so we'll make a nicer tube with neater edges if they oppose. A few more rows with waste yarn just to make sure it's working properly. And change to main yarn and the stitch size for the main yarn. Here's a little trick that helps the transition to main yarn go better. Weight it down by putting it through the eyelet of one of your tools. That's just enough weight to keep the yarn where it needs to be for the first row. Sometimes if you don't have a way of holding it down, and you can use your other hand as well, you will end up with a missed stitch at the beginning of the row. It's best to knit the first 2 main yarn rows slowly, make sure everything is going well, and then you just continue to knit the tube down the length of the hat. We want this hat to be 6 inches long from the top of the crown to the bottom of the brim. If you plan to add an inch of crocheting for the brim, knit 60 rows. If you are going to let the brim roll and create the bottom edge that way, knit 84 rows. It sounds like a lot, I know, but every row on the counter is actually only half a round of knitting. That's the reason. If you are planning to seam the top edge of the hat, you could bind off now, but I personally find it extremely difficult to bind off on both beds. If you're lankier than I am, it may work for you, but still turning your wrist to face the opposing bed is tough. So we can bind off later as long as we leave ourselves a nice long yarn tail. If you plan to bind off and chain stitch, make the length of the tail about 8 times the width of the needle span and work. And then we'll change back to waste yarn and scrap off. And if we're just knitting one hat, scrapping off will be the end of the process. You can remove it from the machine, but you can knit any number of hats in a row. And I'm going to knit a long tube of 4 of them and then show you different ways to handle it. So between each segment, there need to be at least 12 rows of waste yarn, which is in effect 6 rows. It's 12 passes of the carriage. Then we'll change back to main yarn. Leave about a 12-inch tail when starting the main yarn. Knit either 60 or 84 rows as before, and repeat the entire process. 12 rows of scrap yarn minimum. You may want more. After the hat rows, always end with a generous yarn tail of main yarn and make certain that it gets tucked neatly down between the beds. Here I left quite a bit. I'll bind this one off in chain stitch, and so I'm opening the beds to tuck it down. If you are going to use backstitch as your bind off, you do not need quite as much. 5 widths across the needle span should be adequate. On the subject of the waste yarn rows, if you knit the 12 I suggested as a minimum, you are only going to have an inch of waste yarn. If you would like to cut the individual hats apart for easier management while finishing, you need more waste yarn rows. Try 48. A little note on getting the stitch sizes to match on both beds. It may not be at the same number on the dial, and knitting a tube like this is the way that you can determine what matches. Keep tweaking the stitch sizes, keep a record of where you are in the stitch range, and hang a marker at each edge every few rows. When the tube laying flat has the markers exactly on the sides, you have achieved matching stitch sizes, whatever the dial says. To get the rolled brim that's tighter and pulls in more than the basic roll, simply turn down the stitch size dramatically for either the first 12 or the last 12 rows of the tube, and then return it to normal for the next steps. When you have enough hats knitted for today, you may either scrap off using the same waste yarn techniques we've been using, or seam the top of the last hat right on the knitting machine by transferring all the river stitches back to the main bed, then binding them off, both sets of stitches together. This seam will show, but it makes a nice neat ridge at the top of the hat. Today I'm using a loom hook to move the stitches. A double-line needle, of course, is also useful. Any neat bind off is acceptable. My preferred one is to bind off around the gate pegs. If you're noticing my odd tool, it's a handmade one, and I can teach you how to make those in my book, Cool Tools and Cheap Tricks. When the bind off is complete, we can simply lift the work off of the machine, give it a little lengthwise tug because it's been stretched, and the top hat already has its seam. Now let's go finish the whole strip. Either the beginning or the end of any of the main yarn strips can be the gathered crown. We need to run the gathering thread through each stitches on either the beginning or end row. See how these stitches are shaped, pointed at the bottom and curved at the top behind the next stitch? We need to make sure that we locate each one of them and get the yarn through at one time. That can either be done up, down, as in a running stitch, or punching down through the top of each stitch. Here's the running stitch being accomplished. Both ways are about equally easy once you get used to them, but I think punching down through the top of each stitch in order as I'm doing now Makes it a little bit easier to draw the drawstring in. Go all the way around the hat in this manner, but do not pull it tight yet because we want to get the waste yarn off first. If you'd like a little more work room and don't enjoy the closed tube at the cast on end, you can snip the first row, pull it out, and create some access for yourself. A variation that I did not use is that we could have knitted a ravel cord between each waste yarn section and each main yarn section. Because I'm using waste yarn that I've often used as a ravel cord, I didn't bother with that. If you do what I did, you just want to snip and pull out the waste yarn. I didn't do a very tidy job, and if you do it like this, it's pretty much wasted, but it does leave a neat edge in the end. And here it is. Now we are ready to pull the drawstring. Pull it snug, create a tight O at the top of the hat, and stitch across that O a few times for security. Knot the yarn and weave in the tails. So that's the gathered crown. It's one of the options. Now let's look at binding off the live stitches using chain stitch. We can do this whether we intend to seam this end of the hat and make it the top of the crown, or we intend to use it as the brim. This is a good base if you intend to crochet the brim because it crochets onto this chain stitched bind off very nicely. You can chain into the beginning or ending row of live stitches either from the front or the back of the fabric. That's the knit side or the purl side. I personally prefer to do it from the front as I am. And since we are using a tube, we need our yarn supply on the outside, same side as our hands are. So it runs along as you see. Punch into the stitch with your latch tool, yarn over, grabbing a loop of yarn, pull it through, move on to the next stitch, and repeat. When the bind off is complete, we can remove the waste yarn and have a clean edge. Here I'm going to attempt to do a slightly neater job than last time. Snipping the top row in several places, or actually the row that adjoins the main yarn row, whether it be bottom or top, facilitates pulling out the waste yarn in pieces and separating it to leave a clean edge. If you do a neat job like this one, the advantage is that it leaves 5 rows, in this case, of waste yarn attached to the next hat, protecting those stitches from unraveling so that I can work on that hat next. And voila, a bound off edge that can either be seamed or go into the rolled brim, or you can work crocheting into it. Backstitching through the first or last row of main yarn stitches is another acceptable bind off. It's a little bit lighter weight than the chain stitched bind off, and the trick is to get your stitches exactly the right tension. You want to not distort the fabric, let it lay exactly as it falls. It's called backstitch because I back up a stitch, go down, come up 2 stitches away, come up, down, and back, up, forward, and so on. Here's another view of the backstitching process. On this hat, I bound off in 2 different ways. The end that I want to be inside the rolled brim, I chain stitched. The other end, I backstitched. Being a little less weighty, the backstitch will allow the top seam to be less weighty. So here we are using the yarn tail to backstitch the top seam closed. And same as when you're binding off, the tension of your stitches is what makes for a nice seam or a puckery seam. Unlike the seaming done by binding off both sides together on the machine, this seam will be hidden within the hat. The waste yarn can also be removed by manually unknitting the rows. And if you do that, you can wind it back up and use it a second and often a third time. Everywhere a gathered crown is used, remember to run the gathering thread through it, then remove the waste yarn, then finish the gathering. That's the order that works well. You can learn to rewind this amount of yarn on your hand very easily. I believe teaching you how to do that might have been my very first video. I will put a link in the program notes in case you want to learn it. Here is another piece of waste yarn getting snipped in 4 places to come off a bound off edge that has had backstitch worked into it. The lower edge of the hat, where it has been neither seamed nor gathered, will naturally roll up and create the rolled brim. That's just the nature of stockinette. Those who wish to finish with crochet will find that crochet stitches are bigger than knit stitches. So you'll want to work behind the bind off and decrease. Usually I do 2 single crochets into 2 stitches and then work a decrease in single crochet. Sometimes it's a little bit different. It can vary with the yarn and your particular style and so forth. But basically, it'll be 2 or 3 straight stitches and then a single crochet decrease will end up making the edge even with the knitted edge. Here I'm experimenting to see which is going to actually work best. Generally, I find that 3 or 4 rounds of single crochet, turning each row so that you're working from the opposite side of the fabric, followed by a finishing slip stitch around the edge, works well. These bumps were created by experimenting with a technique. I bound off starting on the inside of the fabric, alternating chaining into 2 stitches, then working a single crochet decrease into the next 2, and that's what created these bumps. The remainder of the hem was just as I already described, and for this project, a size E hook worked well for me. These may not be fancy hats, but they're quick, they're serviceable, and many people just love them.